Hey everyone, welcome back to our chapter book read along of The Borrowers. We are getting near the end of our story, but first we must do a quick review. So let's begin with a review of our story. The Borrowers is about a family of little people who live under the floorboards and in old homes. Our little family is the Clocks because they live under the grandfather clock in the main hallway. Their names are Pod, Homily, and Arietti. Pod and Homily are Arietti's parents, and they have been living in this old house for a long time. They're currently the last borrowers left, and the house is run by an old lady who stays in her bed mostly and has a housekeeper and a gardener. Sometimes there's one other maid as well. Well, lately there's also been a little boy hanging around, and that's where the borrowers' troubles started. So they first were seen. Pod climbed up a curtain and got stuck, and the little boy helped him down. But to be seen is not good because most people don't believe that they saw a little person. They think it's a mouse or a bug infestation, and so they call people to get them out. And that's where the borrowers have problems. So we then learn that later, Arietti finally gets to go borrowing for the first time. Her father, Pod, had been the only one doing it because he was very worried and they wanted to keep their daughter safe. Well, turns out that she also needs to learn because what if something happens to Pod? They go out, and when she is out, her first time ever, she gets seen by the boy. They have a conversation, and after talking, the boy learns that Arietti can read pretty well, and he would like to read a little bit better and learn some things. So Arietti promised to help him read some of the books in the schoolroom in the house if Pod, took a letter to her aunt and uncle and cousins who live in a badger hole way on the other side of the fields. Well, they finally get that done, and Arietti gets a letter back. It says to send home her aunt. Well, they don't know where her aunt is, so that's a pretty big problem. The second big problem is that Pod saw Arietti talking to the boy, and that is not good. And they are very worried for all of them, that they could be seen, that they could be kicked out of the house, and that the boy knows all of the places that they hide and where their family is. So her mother and father are not very happy with Arietti and worried about where her aunt could be. So now we're about to see what comes after Pod and Homily learning all about Arietti's secrets. Let's see what happens next in The Borrowers. Chapter 15. That night, while Arietti lay straight and still under her cigar box ceiling, Homily and Pod talked for hours. They talked in the sitting room, they talked in the kitchen, and later, much later, she heard them talk in their bedroom. She heard drawers shutting and opening, doors creaking, and boxes being pulled out from under beds. What are they doing? She wondered. What will happen next? Very still she lay in her soft little bed with her familiar belongings around her. Her postage-stamped view of Rio Harbor, her silver pig off a charm bracelet, her turquoise ring, which sometimes for fun she would wear as a crown, and dearest of all, her floating ladies with the golden trumpets, tooting above their peaceful town. She did not want to lose these, she realized suddenly, lying there straight and still in bed, but to have all the other things as well, adventure and safety mixed, that's what she wanted. And that, the restless bangings and whisperings told her, is just what you couldn't do. As it happened, Homily was only fidgeting, opening drawers and shutting them, unable to be still. And she ended up, when Pod was already in bed, by deciding to curl her hair. "Now, Homily," Pod protested wearily, lying there in his nightshirt. There's really no call for that. Who's gonna see you? That's just it, exclaimed Homily, searching in a drawer for her curl rags. In times like these, one never knows. I'm not going to be caught out, she said irritably, turning the drawer upside down and picking over the spilled contents, with me hair like this. She came to bed at last, looking spiky like a washed-out gollywog, and Pod, with a sigh, turned over at last and closed his eyes. Homily lay for a long time, staring at the oil lamp. It was a silver cap of a perfume bottle with a tiny floating wick. She felt unwilling, for some reason, to blow it out. There were movements upstairs in the kitchen, and it was late for movements. The household should be asleep. And the lumpy curlers pressed uncomfortably against her neck. She gazed, just as Ariette had done, about the familiar room. Too full, she realized, with little bags and boxes and makeshift cupboards, and thought, what now? Perhaps nothing will happen after all. The child perhaps is right. And we are making a good deal of fuss about nothing very much. This boy, when all's said and done, is only a guest, perhaps, thought Homily. He'll go away again quite soon, and that, she told herself drowsily, will be that. Later, as she realized afterwards, she must have dozed off, because it seemed she was crossing Parkins Beck. It was night and the wind was blowing and the field seemed very steep. She was scrambling up it, along the ridge by the gas pipe, sliding and falling in the wet grass. The trees, it seemed to Homily, were thrashing and clashing, their branches waving and sawing against the sky. Then, as she told them many weeks later, there was a sound of splintering wood. And Homily woke up. She saw the room again and the oil lamp flickering, but something, she knew at once, was different. There was a strange draught, and her mouth felt dry and full of grit. Then she looked up at the ceiling. Pod! She shrieked, clutching his shoulder. Pod rolled over and sat up. They both stared at the ceiling. The whole surface was on a steep slant, and one side of it come right away from the wall. This was what had caused the draught. And down into the room, to within an inch of the foot of the bed, protruded a curious object. A huge bar of gray steel with a flattened, shiny edge. It's a screwdriver, said Pod. They stared at it, fascinated, unable to move, and for a moment, all was still. Then, slowly, the huge object swayed upward until the sharp edge lay against their ceiling, and Homily heard a scrape on the floor above and a sudden human gasp. On my knees, cried Homily. Oh, my feeling! As, with a splintered wretch, their whole roof flew off and fell down with a clatter, somewhere out of sight. Homily screamed then, but this time it was a real scream, loud and shrill and hearty. She seemed almost to settle down in her scream while her eyes stared up, half interested, into empty lighted space. There was another ceiling, she realized, way up above them, higher, it seemed, than the sky. A ham hung from it and 2 strings of onions. Ariette appeared in the doorway, scared and trembling, clutching her nightgown, and Pod slapped Homily's back. I've done, he said. That's enough. And Homily suddenly was quiet. A great face appeared then between them and that distant height. It wavered above them, smiling and terrible. There was a silence, and Homily sat bolt upright, her mouth open. Is that your mother? Asked a surprised voice after a moment, and Ariette from the doorway whispered, Yes. It was the boy. Pod got out of bed and stood beside it, shivering in his nightshirt. Come on, he said to Homily. You can't stay there. But Homily could. She had her old nightdress on with the patch in the back, and nothing was going to move her. A slow anger was rising up in Homily. She had been caught in her hair curlers. Pod had raised his hand to her, and she remembered that, in general turmoil, or for once in her life, she had left the supper washing up for morning. would be on the kitchen table for all the world to see. She glared at the boy. He was only a child after all. Put it back, she said. Put it back at once. Her eyes flashed and her curlers seemed to quiver. He knelt down then, but Homily did not flinch as the great face came slowly closer. She saw under his lip, pink and full, like an enormous exaggeration of Ariette's, and she saw it wobble slightly. But I've got something for you, he said. Homily's expression did not change, and Ariette called out from her place in the doorway, What is it? The boy reached behind him, and very gingerly, careful to keep it upright, he held a wooden object above their heads. It's this, he said, and very carefully, his tongue out and breathing heavily, he lowered the object slowly into their hole. It was a doll's dresser, complete with plates. It had 2 drawers in it and a cupboard below. He adjusted its position at the foot of Homily's bed. Ariette ran round to see it better. Oh, she cried ecstatically. Mother, look! Homily threw the dresser a glance. It was dark oak and the plates were hand-painted, and then she quickly looked away again. Yes, she said coldly, very nice. There was a short silence, which no one knew how to break. The cupboard really opens, the boy said at last, and great hand came down all amongst them, smelling of bath soap. Ariette flattened herself against the wall, and Pod exclaimed nervous, No, then. Yes, agreed Homily after a moment. I see it does. Pod drew a long breath, a sigh of relief as the hand went back. There, Homily, he said placency. You've always wanted something like that. Yes, said Homily. She still sat bolt upright, her hands clasped at her lap. Thank you very much. And now, she went on coldly, will you please put back the roof? Wait a minute, pleaded the boy. Again he reached behind him, and again the hand came down, and there beside the dresser, where there was barely room for it, was a very small doll's chair. It was a Victorian chair, upholstered in red velvet. Oh, Ariette exclaimed again, and Pod said shyly, Just about fit me, that would. Try it, begged the boy, and Pod threw him a nervous glance. Go on, said Ariette, and Pod sat down, in his nightshirt, his bare feet showing. That's nice, he said after a moment. It could go by the fire in the sitting room, cried Ariette. It would look lovely on red blotting paper. Let's try it, said the boy, and the hand came down again. Pod sprang up just in time to steady the dresser as the red velvet chair was whisked away above his head and placed presumably in the next room but one. Ariette ran out of the door along the passage to see. Oh, she called out to her parents, come and see, it's lovely. But Pod and Homily did not move. The boy was leaning over them, breathing hard, and they could see the middle buttons of his nightshirt. He seemed to be examining the farther room. What do you keep in that mustard pot? He asked. Coal, said Ariette's voice, and I helped to borrow this new carpet. There's a watch I told you about and the pictures. I could get you some better stamps than those, the boy said. I've got Jubilee ones with the Taj Mahal. Look, cried Ariette's voice again, and Pod took Homily's hand. These are my books. Homily clutched Pod as the great hand came down once more in the direction of Ariette. Quiet, he whispered. Sit still. The boy, it seemed, was touching the books. What are they called? He asked, and Ariette reeled off the names. Pod, whispered Homily. I'm going to scream. No, whispered Pod. You mustn't. Not again. I feel it coming on, said Homily. Pod looked worried. Hold your breath, he said, and count to 10. The boy was saying to Ariette, Why couldn't you read me those? Well, I could, said Ariette, but I'd rather read something new. But you never came, complained the boy. I know, said Ariette, but I will. Pod, whispered Homily. Did you hear that? Did you hear what she said? Yes, yes, Pod whispered. Keep quiet. Do you want to see the storerooms? Ariete suggested next, and Homily clasped a hand on her mouth as though to stifle a cry. Pod looked up at the boy. "Hey," he called, trying to attract his attention. The boy looked down. "Put the roof back now," Pod begged him, trying to sound matter-of-fact and reasonable. "We're getting cold." "All right," agreed the boy, but he seemed to hesitate. He reached across them for a piece of board which formed their roof. "Shall I nail you down?" he asked, and they saw him pick up the hammer. It swayed above them, very dangerous looking. "Of course, nail us down," Pod said irritably. "I mean," said the boy, "I've got some more things upstairs." Pod looked uncertain, and Homily nudged him. "Ask him," she whispered. "What kinds of things?" What kinds of things?" asked Pod. "Things from an old doll's house there is on the top shelf of the cupboard by the fireplace in the schoolroom." "I've never seen an old doll's house," said Pod. "Well, it's in the cupboard," said the boy, "right up by the ceiling. You can't see it. You've got to climb on the lower shelves to get it." "What sort of things are in the doll's house?" asked Ariete from the sitting room. "Oh, everything," the boy said to her. "Carpets and rugs and beds with mattresses. There's a bird in a cage, not a real one, of course, and cooking pans and tables and 5 gilt chairs, a pot with a palm in it, a dish of plaster tarts, and an imitation leg of mutton." Homily leaned across the Pod. "Tell him to nail us down lightly," she whispered. Pod stared at her, and she nodded vigorously, clasping her hands. Pod turned to the boy. "All right," he said. "You nail us down, but lightly, if you see what I mean. Just a tap or two here and there." Chapter 16. Then began a curious phase in their lives, borrowings beyond all dreams of borrowing, a golden age. Every night the floor was opened and treasures would appear, a real carpet for the sitting room, a tiny coal scuttle, a stiff little sofa with damask cushions, a double bed with a round bolster, a single ditto with a striped mattress, framed pictures instead of stamps, a kitchen stove, which didn't work but looked lovely in the kitchen. There were oval tables and square tables, a little desk with one drawer, and 2 maple wardrobes, one with a looking glass, and a bureau with curved legs. Homily grew not only accustomed to the roof coming off, but went so far as to suggest to Pod that he put the board on hinges. "It's just the hammering I don't care for," she explained. "It brings down the dirt." When the boy brought them a grand piano, Homily begged Pod to build a drawing room. "Next to the sitting room," she said, "and we can move the storerooms further down. Then we could have those gilt chairs he talks about, and the palm in a pot." Pod, however, was a little tired of furniture removing. He was looking forward to quiet evenings where he could doze at last beside the fire in his new red velvet chair. No sooner had he put a chest of drawers in one place when Homily, coming in and out of the door to get the effect, made him try it somewhere else. And every evening, at about his usual bedtime, the roof would fly up and more stuff would arrive. But Homily was tireless, bright-eyed and pink-cheeked. After a long day of pushing and pulling, she still would leave nothing until the morning. "Let's just try it," she would beg, lifting up one end of a large doll's sideboard so that Pod could lift the other. "It won't take but a minute." But as Pod well knew, in actual fact, it would be several hours before, disheveled and aching, they finally dropped into bed. Even then, Homily would sometimes hop out to have one last look. In the meantime, in payment for these riches, Ariete would read to the boy every afternoon in the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He would lie on his back, and she would stand beside his shoulder and tell him when to turn the page. They were happy days to look back on afterwards, with this blue sky beyond the cherry boughs, and the grasses softly stirring, and the boy's great ear listening beside her. She grew to know that ear quite well, with its curves and shadows and sunlit pinks and golds. Sometimes, as she grew bolder, she would lean against his shoulder. He was very still while she read to him, and always grateful. What worlds they would explore together. Strange worlds to Ariadne. She learned a lot, and some of the things she learned were hard to accept. She was made to realize once and for all that this earth on which they lived, turning about in space, did not revolve, as she believed, for the sake of little people. Not for big people either, she reminded the boy when she saw his secret smile. In the cool of the evening, Pod would come for her, a rather weary Pod, disheveled and dusty, to take her back for tea. And at home, there would be an excited Homily with fresh delights to discover. "Shut your eyes," Homily would cry. "Now open them." And Ariadne, in a dream of joy, would see her home transformed. All kinds of surprises were there. Even one day, lace curtains at the grating looped up with a pink string. Their only sadness was that there was no one there to see. No visitors, no casual droppers in, no admiring cries of envious glances. What would Homily have not given for an overmantel or a harpsichord? Even a rain barrel would have been better than no one at all. "You write to your Uncle Heron, dearie," Homily suggested, "and tell him. A nice long letter, mind, and don't leave anything out." Ariadne began the letter on the back of one of the discarded pieces of blotting paper, but it became as she wrote. It was just a dull list, far too long, like a sale catalog or the inventory of a house to let. She would have to keep jumping up to count spoons or to look up words in the dictionary, and after a while she laid it aside. There was just so much else to do, so many new books to read, and so much now that she could talk of with the boy. "He's been ill," she told her mother and father. "He's been here for a quiet and the country air, but soon he'll go back to India. Did you know," she asked the amazed Homily, "that the Arctic night lasts 6 months, and the distance between the two poles is less than that between the two extremes of a diameter drawn to the equator?" Yes, they were happy days, and all would have been well, as Pod said afterwards, if they had stuck to borrowing from the doll's house. No one in the human household seemed to remember it was there, and consequently, nothing was missed. The drawing room, however, could not help but the temptation. It was so seldom used nowadays, and there were so many knick-knack tables which had been out of Pod's reach, and the boy, of course, could just turn the key in the glass doors of the cabinet. The silver violin he brought them first, and then the silver harp. It stood no higher than Pod's shoulder, and Pod restrung it with horsehair from the sofa in the morning room. "A musical conversation! That's what we could have!" cried the excited Homily as Ariadne struck a tiny, tuneless note on a horsehair string. "If only," she went on feverishly, clasping her hands, "your father would start on the drawing room." She curled her hair nearly every evening nowadays, and since the house was more or less straight, she would occasionally change for dinner into a satin dress. It hung like a sack, but Homily called it Grecian. "We could use your painted ceiling," she explained to Ariadne, "and there are quite enough of those toy builders' bricks to make a parquet floor." Parquet, she would say, parquet, just like the harpsichords. Even great Aunt Sophie, right away upstairs in the little grandeur of her bedroom, seemed distantly affected by the spirit of the endeavor which seemed to flow in gleeful whirls and eddies about the old house. Several times lately, Pod, when he went into her room, had found her out of bed. He went there nowadays not to borrow, but to rest. The room, one might almost say, had become his club, a place to which he would go to get away from things. Pod was a little irked by his riches. He had never visualized, not in his wildest dreams, borrowing such as this. Homily, he felt, should call a halt. Surely now their home had been grand enough. these jeweled snuff boxes and diamond-encrusted miniatures, these filigree vanity cases, and desk-grain figurines, all, as he knew from the drawing room cabinet, were not really necessary. What was the good of a shepherdess nearly as tall as Arrietty, or an outsized candle snuffer? Sitting just inside the fender, he could warm his hands at the fire. He watched Aunt Sophie hobble slowly round the room on her 2 sticks. "She'll be downstairs soon, I shouldn't wonder," he thought glumly, hardly listening to her oft-told tale about royal luncheon aboard the Russian yacht. "And then she'll miss these things." It was not Aunt Sophie, however, who missed them first. It was Mrs. Driver. Mrs. Driver had never forgotten the trouble over Rosa Pickhatchet. It had not been, at the time, easy to pinpoint the guilt. Even Crampfurl had felt under suspicion. "From now on," Mrs. Driver had said, "I'll manage on my own. No more strange maids in this house. Not if I'm to stay on myself." A drop of Merida here, a pair of old stockings there, a handkerchief or so, an odd vest, or an occasional pair of gloves, these, Mrs. Driver felt, were different. These were within her rights, but trinkets out of the drawing-room cabinet, that, she told herself grimly, staring at the depleted shelves, was a different story altogether. She felt tricked, standing there on that fateful day in the spring sunshine, feather duster in hand. Her little black eyes had become slits of anger and cunning. It was, she calculated, as though someone, suspecting her dishonesty, were trying to catch her out. But who could it be? Crampfurl? The boy? The man who came to wind the clocks? These things had disappeared gradually, one by one. It was someone, of that she felt sure, who knew the house, and someone who wished her ill. Could it, she wondered suddenly, be the old lady herself? The old girl had been out of bed lately and walking around her room. Might she not have come downstairs in the night, poking about with her stick, snooping and spying? Mrs. Driver remembered suddenly the empty Madeira bottle and 2 glasses which so often were left on the kitchen table. Ah, thought Mrs. Driver, was not this just the sort of thing she might do? The sort of thing she would cackle over back upstairs again amongst her pillows, watching and waiting for Mrs. Driver to report the loss. "Everything all right downstairs, Driver?" That's what she'd always say, and she would look at Mrs. Driver sideways out of those wicked old eyes of hers. "A nice Mary Andrew she'd look if you caught her. I wouldn't put it past her," Mrs. Driver exclaimed aloud, gripping her feather duster as though it were a club. "And a nice Mary Andrew she'd look if I caught her at it, creeping about the downstairs rooms middle of the night." "All right, my lady," muttered Mrs. Driver grimly. "Pry and pot all you want. 2 can play at that game." Chapter 17. Mrs. Driver was short with Crampfurl that evening. She would not sit down and drink with him as usual, but stumped about the kitchen, looking at him sideways every now and again out of the corners of her eyes. He seemed uneasy, as indeed he was. There was a kind of menace in her silence, a hidden something which no one could ignore. Even Aunt Sophie had felt it when Mrs. Driver brought up her wine. She heard it clink out of the decanter against the glass as Mrs. Driver set down the tray and the rattle of the wooden rings as Mrs. Driver drew the curtains. It was in the tremble of the floorboards as Mrs. Driver crossed the room and in the click of the latch as Mrs. Driver closed the door. "What's the matter with her now?" Aunt Sophie wondered vaguely as, delicately, ungreedily, she poured her first glass. The boy had felt it too, from the way Mrs. Driver had stared at him as he sat hunched in the bath, from the way she soaped the sponge and the way she said, "And now," and had scrubbed him slowly with careful, angry steadiness. And all through the bathing time, she did not say a word. When he was in bed, she had gone through all his things, peering into cupboards and opening up drawers. She had pulled his suitcase out from under the wardrobe and found his dear dead mole, and his hoard of sugar lumps, and her best potato knife. But even then, she had not spoken. She had thrown the mole into the wastepaper basket and had made angry noises with her tongue. She had pocketed the potato knife and all the sugar lumps. She had stared at him a moment before she turned the gas low. A strange stare it had been, more puzzled than accusing. Mrs. Driver slept above the scullery. She had her own back stairs. That night she did not undress. She set the alarm clock for midnight and put it where the tick would not disturb her, outside the door. She unbuttoned her tight shoes and crawled, grunting a little, under her covers. She had barely closed her eyes, as she told Crumpfurl afterwards, when the clock shrilled off, chattering and rattling on its four thin legs on the bare boards of the passageway. Mrs. Driver trembled herself out of bed and fumbled her way to the door. "Shush!" she had said to the clock as she felt for the catch. "Shush!" and clasped it to her bosom. She stood there, in her stockinged feet, at the head of the scullery stairs. Something, it seemed, had flickered below. A hint of light. Mrs. Driver peered down again at the dark curve of the narrow stairway. Yes, there it was again. A moth-wing flutter. Candlelight, that's what it was. A moving candle beyond the stairs, beyond the scullery, somewhere within the kitchen. Clock in hand, Mrs. Driver creaked down the stairs in her stockinged feet, panting a little in her eagerness. There seemed a sigh in the darkness, an echo of movement, and it seemed to Mrs. Driver, standing there on the cold stone flags of the scullery, that this sound was barely a sound, could only mean one thing. The soft swing to of the green baize door, the door which led out of the kitchen into the main hall beyond. Hurriedly, Mrs. Driver felt her way into the kitchen and fumbled for matches along the ledge above the stove. She knocked off a pepper pot and a paper bag of cloves, and glancing quickly downwards, saw a filament of light. She saw it in the second before she struck a match. A thread of light, it looked like, on the floor beside her feet. It ran an oblong shape, outlining a rough square. Mrs. Driver grasped and lit the gas, and the room leapt up around her. She glanced quickly at the baize door. There seemed to her startled eye a quiver of movement in it, as though it had just swung to. She ran to it and pushed it open, but the passage beyond was still and dark. No flicker or shadow, nor sound of distant footfall. She let the door fall to again, and watched it as it swung back, slowly, regretfully, held by its heavy spring. Yes, that was the sound she had heard from the scullery, that sighing whisper, like an inward-drawn breath. Cautiously, clutching back her skirts, Mrs. Driver moved toward the stove. An object lay there, something pinkish, on the floor beside the jutting board. Ah, she realized, that board. That was where the light had come from. She hesitated and glanced around the kitchen. Everything else seemed normal, just as she had left it. The plates on the dresser, the saucepans on the wall, the row of tea towels hanging symmetrically on their string above the stove. The pinkish object she saw now was a heart-shaped box, one that she knew well, from the glass-in tray table above the fireplace in the drawing room. She picked it up. It was enamel and gold and set with tiny brilliants. "Well, she began, and stooping swiftly with a sudden angry movement, she wrenched back the piece of the floor. And then she shrieked, loud and long. She saw movement, a running, a scrambling, a fluttering. She heard a squeaking, a jabbering, a gasping. Little people they looked like, with hands and feet, and mouths opening. That's what they looked like. But they couldn't be that, of course, running here and there and everywhere. "Oh, oh, oh!" she shrieked, and felt behind her for a chair. She clambered onto it. It wobbled beneath her, and she climbed, still shrieking, from chair to table. And there she stood, marooned, crying and gasping, and calling out for help until, after hours it seemed, there was a rattling at the scullery door. Crumpfurl it was, roused at last by the light and the noise. "What is it?" he called. "Let me in!" But Mrs. Driver would not leave the table. A nest, she shouted, alive and squeaking. Cramford threw his weight against the door and burst open the lock. He staggered, slightly dazed, into the kitchen, his corduroy trousers pulled over his nightshirt. "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath his tousled hair. "What sort of nest?" "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath his tousled hair. "What sort of nest?" Mrs. Driver, sobbing still with fright, pointed at the floor. Cramford walked over in his slow, deliberate way and stooped down. He saw the hole in the floor, lined and cluttered with small objects. Children's toys, they looked like. Bits of rubbish, that was all. "It's nothing," he said after a moment. "It's that boy, that's what it is." He stirred the contents with his foot, and all the partitions fell down. "There ain't nothing alive in there." "Well, I saw them, I tell you," gasped Mrs. Driver. "Little people with hands and mice dressed up." Cramford stared into the hole. "Mice dressed up?" he repeated uncertainly. "Hundreds of them," went on Mrs. Driver, "running and squeaking. I saw them, I tell you." "Well, there ain't there now," said Cramford, and he gave a final stir around with his boot. "Then they've run away," she cried, "under the floor, up inside the walls. This place is alive with them." "Well," said Cramford stolidly, "maybe, but if you ask me, I think that's the boy, where he hides things." His eye brightened and went down on one knee. "Where he's got the ferret, I shouldn't wonder." "Listen," cried Mrs. Driver, and there was a despairing note in her voice. "You've got to listen. This wasn't no boy, and it wasn't no ferret." She reached for the back of the chair and lowered herself clumsily onto the floor. She came beside him to the ledge of the hole. "They had hands and faces, I tell you." "Look," she said, pointing. "See that? It's a bed. And now come to think of it, one of them was in it." "Now you come to think of it," said Cramford. "Yes," went on Mrs. Driver firmly, "and there's something else I come to think of. Remember that girl, Rosa Pickhatchet?" "The one that we fired?" "Well, yes, she saw one in the drawing room mantelpiece with a beard." "Mice dressed up," said Cramford. "Not mice," Mrs. Driver almost shouted. "Mice don't have beards." "But you said," began Cramford. "Oh, yes, I know I said it. Not that these had beards, but what would you call them? What would you call them but mice?" "Not so loud," whispered Cramford. "You'll wake the house up." "They can't hear," said Mrs. Driver. "Not through the baize door." She went to the stove and picked up the fire tongs. "And what if they do? We ain't done nothing. Move over," she went on, "and let me get to that hole." One by one, Mrs. Driver picked things out, with many shocked gasps and cries of astonishment. "And do you evers!" She made 2 piles on the floor, one of valuables and one of what she called rubbish. Curious objects dangled from the tongs. "Would you believe it? Her best lace handkerchiefs. Look, here's another, and another. And my big mattress needle. I knew I had one. My silver thimble, if you please, and one of hers. And look, oh my, at the walls, the cottons. No wonder you can never find a spool of white cotton if you want one. Potatoes, nuts. Look at this, a pot of caviar. Caviar. No, it's too much, it really is. Doors, chairs, tables. And look at this blotting paper. Oh, that's where it goes. Oh, my goodness gracious!" she cried suddenly, her eyes staring. "What's this?" Mrs. Driver laid down the tongs and leaned over the hole, tentatively and fearfully, as though afraid of being stung. "It's a watch, an emerald her watch, and she never even missed it." Her voice rose. "And it's going! Look, you can see by the kitchen clock. 12:25. Mrs. Driver sat down suddenly on a hard chair. Her eyes were staring, and her face looked white and flabby, as though deflated. "Do you know what this means?" she said to Cramford. "No." "The police," said Mrs. Driver. "That's what this means. A case for the police." All right, that's where we're going to end for now. Pretty big cliffhanger, though. I wonder what's going to happen to our borrowers. We'll have to see in our next video, which is the final couple chapters of our book. But first, I have a couple questions about what we just read. Why was it that Homily put curlers in her hair? Do you remember? She wanted to make sure if someone was going to see her, she was going to look really good. List at least 2 things that the boy said he could bring for the borrowers from the upstairs dollhouse. He said a lot of stuff, didn't he? Do you remember at least 2 things? I'll give you some hints. Carpets and rugs, beds with mattresses, cooking pans, chairs, tables, pots and pans, a potted plant with a palm tree in it. Whew, there were lots of things. Did you remember a couple? All right, who does Mrs. Driver, the housekeeper, think stole the objects from the sitting room at first? What do you think? You remember? She thought that Aunt Sophie had stolen the things, kind of just to see if Mrs. Driver would ask about them. So Mrs. Driver, as we found, has been taking things slowly from the house as well. And she thinks it's her right because she's worked there for such a long time. And it's little things that Aunt Sophie won't miss. But she thinks Aunt Sophie's trying to get back at her, isn't she? Well, she finds out that it is not Aunt Sophie, and our borrowers are in big trouble. Well, their house got literally ransacked. Crumfrel put his foot in there. Well, we'll see in our next chapter exactly what our borrowers are going to do, and hopefully how the boy can help them get out of this mess. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.